August 14, 1827, Charleston, South Carolina. A thunderstorm rolled across the lowcountry that night, shaking the windows of the old plantation houses. By sunrise, one of Charleston's most powerful men, Josiah Crane, was dead, his skull crushed so completely that even the coroner said he had never seen such force from human hands. Physicians found bone fragments buried in the mahogany desk 6 feet away. They said whoever did it had the strength of an ox, or maybe something worse. Only one person could have done it, a woman. 6 feet 8 inches tall. Over 240 pounds of muscle. Her name was Sarah Drummond, and the night Crane died, she vanished into the swamps and was never seen again. For almost 200 years, historians have argued about whether she was real or just a ghost story meant to hide the sins of slavery. But the records, bills of sale, medical notes, and eyewitness letters, all say one chilling thing. Sarah Drummond existed, and what happened in that library wasn't random violence. It was the end of a horror that began 4 years earlier, with money. Before we go back to the start, hit subscribe if you love true American mysteries that mix real history with dark legend. And tell me in the comments, what city or state are you watching from? I read them all. Now, let's rewind the clock to 1823, to a Charleston built on wealth, suffering, and secrets. The city of chains. In the spring of 1823, the port of Charleston was booming. Ships from the Caribbean, West Africa, and Virginia crowded the harbor, their decks loaded with people, men, women, and children, to be sold like property. Charleston wasn't just another southern city. It was the capital of the American slave trade, the place where fortunes were made from rice, cotton, and human lives. Out on the rice plantations beyond the city, enslaved workers stood knee-deep in swamp water all day, under a burning sun, surrounded by mosquitoes, snakes, and alligators. Many never survived their first year. Historians say nearly 1/3 died before the next harvest. That meant planters constantly needed new workers, and slave traders hunted across the South for anyone strong enough to survive the rice fields. Sometimes, they found someone who was different. Someone who could bring in an extraordinary price. The auction on Chalmers Street. March 1823. A slave trader named Caleb Rutherford arrived in Charleston leading a line of 37 enslaved people he'd bought in Virginia and North Carolina. Among them was a young woman, maybe 19 or 20 years old, who towered over everyone. When she stepped into the auction yard on Chalmers Street, the crowd went silent. People whispered that she was nearly 7 feet tall. That her hands were so big she could wrap one completely around a man's head. They called her Sarah. No last name. She'd been born on a small farm in North Carolina, the daughter of an enslaved woman whose name history has erased. Today, doctors would say Sarah suffered from pituitary gigantism, a rare condition that makes the body grow uncontrollably tall and strong. But in 1823, people saw her as something unnatural, half woman, half monster. The auction house was packed that morning. Planters, merchants, curious onlookers, all wanting to see the giant woman from Carolina. The auctioneer, James Vanderhorst, later said he'd sold thousands of people in his lifetime but had never seen anyone like her. Bidding started at $400, high for the time, but it skyrocketed. $800, $1,000. Finally, a man at the back of the room raised his hand. $1,300, he said. Gasps filled the room. It was one of the highest prices ever paid for a single enslaved person that year. The buyer's name was Josiah Crane, a wealthy rice planter who owned a sprawling estate called Marsh Bend, about 18 miles southwest of Charleston. Crane was known for his temper, a man who believed kindness was weakness. He'd lost his wife years earlier and ruled his plantation like a soldier. When the sale ended, Sarah was led off the platform, wrists chained, a leather collar around her neck burned with Crane's initials. Witnesses said she never spoke, never cried, just stared forward with dark, silent eyes. As Crane loaded her into his wagon, an old free black woman selling flowers near the market whispered something that several people later remembered. That man just bought his own death. Marsh Bend Plantation. Marsh Bend was everything the Lowcountry was famous for, and everything it should have been feared for. A grand white columned house stood above hundreds of acres of flooded rice fields that glistened like mirrors under the sun. Beyond it stretched rows of slave cabins made of rough wood, with dirt floors and no windows. Mosquitoes filled the air. The water stank of decay. When Sarah arrived at Marsh Bend, she was assigned to cabin number 7, shared with 5 other women. The overseer, Porter Grimble, wrote to his brother that week, saying, "She is a creature of such unnatural dimensions that when she stands at full height, she resembles a colossus more than a Christian woman." But Crane hadn't spent $1,300 for Sarah to work the fields. He had other ideas. Within days, he started showing her off. He invited guests from Charleston and neighboring plantations to come see the giant woman he'd purchased. He'd make Sarah stand on the veranda like a trophy, forcing her to lift barrels, bend iron tools, or simply stand beside him so visitors could marvel at her size. Some laughed. Some stared in disgust. Sarah never said a word. To them, she was property. To him, she was entertainment. But something dark was already brewing beneath her silence, something that would one day explode in that library with the sound of splintering bone. Outro. Narrator tone. That was just the beginning. In the next part, we'll go deeper into life at Marsh Bend, the cruelty, the whispers about strange lights in the swamps, and how Sarah Drummond's quiet rage began to take form. If you're hooked on this true horror history, hit subscribe, drop a comment with your city or state, and share this video so more people can discover the forgotten story of the Giant of Charleston. Part 2, The Monster of Marsh Bend, coming next. Would you like me to continue with Part 2 in the same cinematic YouTube-ready style, 1,000 words, easy language, strong emotional pacing? Sarah Drummond, The Giant of Charleston, Part 2, The Wall of Marsh Bend. Hook. Narrator tone. When people spoke about Marsh Bend Plantation, they whispered about the rice, the snakes, the heat. But after 1823, they whispered about her. They said she could lift a full barrel of rice, 300 pounds, like it was nothing. They said her hands were so big she could cover a man's face completely. They said she didn't flinch at pain, didn't break under the whip, didn't cry. Her name was Sarah Drummond, the woman who would one day kill her master with her bare hands. But before that night of blood and thunder, before she became a legend whispered across Charleston, she was a woman trapped in hell. This is part 2 of The Giant of Charleston. If you love dark American history and true horror born from real events, hit subscribe, tap like, and tell me what state or city you're watching from. I read every comment, and trust me, this story only gets darker. The Living Exhibition. By May of 1823, Josiah Crane had turned Sarah into his private sideshow. Visitors came from miles around, planters, doctors, and men with money to burn, just to stare at the giant woman of Marsh Bend. Crane would make her lift barrels packed with rice, iron anvils, even live pigs squealing in her arms. He'd grin and boast, strongest woman in the Carolinas, while his guests laughed and sipped brandy. He'd stand beside her, letting them see how tiny he looked in comparison. He'd stretch out his hand and tell other men, "Go on, put your hand in hers." And when they did, their fingers looked like those of children. One visitor, a Charleston physician named Drive Edmund Porcher, kept a diary, and what he wrote still chills historians today. Mr. Crane has acquired a female specimen of most extraordinary proportions. She stands at least 6½ feet in height, with hands and feet of such dimension I scarce believed my own eyes. I watched her lift a barrel of rice weighing no less than 300 pounds with ease. The sight unsettled me, as though nature had overstepped her own boundaries. Sarah never smiled, never spoke. To Crane's guests, she was a curiosity. To herself, she was a prisoner. Hell in the swamps. When the show ended, Crane sent her back to the fields, where life was far worse than any exhibition. Rice work was torture. The enslaved started before dawn, standing in murky water up to their thighs for 10 to 12 hours a day. The air buzzed with mosquitoes thick enough to choke on. The heat pressed down like a weight. Water moccasins slid between legs. Leeches clung to ankles. And through it all, Sarah labored, silent, massive, unstoppable. She could carry twice what other workers could. She could operate the heavy wooden pestles that crushed rice with terrifying speed. But her strength also made her a target. Whenever Crane wanted to teach a lesson, to remind everyone who was master, he didn't pick the weakest worker. He picked Sarah, not because she disobeyed, but because punishing someone that strong sent a message: no one is safe. The punishments. Records from the 1820s describe the brutal tools used on southern plantations. The whipping post, the wooden stocks, and a device called the buck, where a person's arms and legs were tied under a stick, forcing them into unbearable pain for hours. Overseer Porter Grimble wrote about Sarah in his letters, 3 times that year alone. Each letter mentioned her punishment. Each time, she returned to work the next morning. Standing tall, silent, she wouldn't break, and that silence, that unbending strength, began to frighten even her captors. Among the enslaved people, she became something more than a woman. She became a symbol. They called her Tall Sarah, or simply, the Wall. Because when she stood between you and the overseer's whip, the whip stopped. There were stories whispered at night. Of her shielding children too young to work. Of carrying fainted workers back to their cabins. Of standing motionless when Crane tried to sell families apart. No one could move her unless she allowed it. And Crane was beginning to realize that force might not be enough to control her. The refusal. Summer, 1824. Charleston gentleman Augustus Pemberton came to Marsh Bend with an offer. He'd heard the rumors about the giant slave woman, and wanted her for his traveling exhibition, a showcase of natural curiosities and wonders. He offered Crane $300 to rent Sarah for 2 weeks. Crane was delighted. Money and publicity. Perfect. He told Sarah the arrangement. He expected obedience. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye and said, quietly, "I will not go." Crane froze. He'd never heard her speak that way. He repeated the order. Louder. She said it again, calm, steady. "I will not go." Rage consumed him. He called for the overseer. He ordered her whipped immediately. The wall doesn't move. 4 men grabbed her arms, trying to drag her toward the whipping post. But Sarah didn't fight. She simply stopped moving. She became a statue, solid as a mountain. The men pushed, pulled, struck her with canes. She didn't budge. Grimble shouted for more help. 8 men total. Ropes. Threats. They told her they'd hurt others if she didn't move. Finally, Sarah walked, not for herself, but to protect others. 30 lashes. A braided leather whip. Witnesses said she didn't make a single sound. Blood soaked her dress, but she never cried out. When it was over, she walked back to her cabin alone, her back torn open, but her head high. She didn't go to Charleston. Crane told Pemberton she'd fallen ill. But everyone knew the truth. The giant woman had defied her master, and he had backed down. From that day on, Crane's control began to crack. The uneasy peace. Over the next year, an uneasy silence hung over Marsh Bend. Crane still showed Sarah to visitors, but never again tried to take her off the plantation. He avoided direct confrontations, though punishments still came, fewer, quieter. The people in the cabins noticed it first. Crane, once proud and cruel, had started watching Sarah the way a man watches a thundercloud, knowing it's going to break, but not knowing when. And then, in early 1826, something changed again. Sarah was pregnant. The news spread through the quarters like fire. The father, they said, was Marcus, the plantation carpenter, a calm, thoughtful man who had lost his own wife and daughter years before. For the first time in her life, Sarah had something of her own. A reason to hope, and a new reason for Crane to fear her. Because a woman with something to love, is a woman you can no longer control. Outro. Narrator tone. In the next episode, Part 3, The Child of the Swamp, Sarah's pregnancy becomes the spark that lights the fire at Marsh Bend. And the horror that follows will make the Charleston legend of Sarah Drummond far more than just a ghost story. If you're drawn into this dark piece of American history, subscribe now, drop a comment with your state, and share this video with someone who loves true horror rooted in reality. Part 3, The Child of the Swamp, coming soon. Would you like me to continue immediately with Part 3, 1000 words, same cinematic YouTube narration style? Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 3, The Cry in the Cold. Historic horror series based on true accounts. In the frozen silence of a South Carolina night, a scream tore through the darkness, a sound so raw and full of pain that even the overseers stopped in their tracks. It wasn't the sound of punishment or labor, it was something else. Something that would change everything at Marsh Bend Plantation. This is part 3 of The Chains of Marsh Bend, a story of strength, horror, and one mother's fight against the darkness of slavery. Part 3: The Cry in the Cold. Approximately 1,000 words, simple language for storytelling. The cold winter of 1827 had wrapped Marsh Bend in a heavy silence. Frost clung to the rice fields, and the wind sliced through the cabins like knives. But in Cabin 7, that silence was broken by the sound of agony. Sarah was in labor. 2 women, Hester and Dinah, worked by candlelight, whispering prayers between Sarah's cries. The strong woman who had never screamed during a whipping now screamed loud enough to wake the dead. Her voice carried across the plantation and even reached the main house. Josiah Crane, half asleep in his warm bed, heard it. Annoyed, he lit a lantern and walked out into the cold, following the sound. He stood outside Cabin 7, watching his breath cloud in the air as the screams continued. The noise went on for hours until, finally, just before dawn, a baby cried. A boy. He was huge for a newborn, nearly 11 pounds, but healthy and loud. The moment Sarah saw him, something broke inside her. The woman who had never shed a tear wept openly, holding the child close to her chest. She whispered a name no one else could hear. Later, everyone learned it: Jacob. Marcus, the man who loved her, was allowed inside shortly after. He looked down at the child, and though no words were spoken, everyone who saw them said something passed between them, a decision, a promise, maybe both. For a few short weeks, Cabin 7 felt alive. Sarah sang softly while rocking Jacob, her deep voice like thunder rolling across the fields. Marcus carved small wooden animals, a bird, a dog, a bear, and laid them in the cradle he had built by hand. The other enslaved people began to whisper. For once, there was warmth inside the cold world of Marsh Bend. But Josiah Crane was watching. By the summer of 1827, Jacob was 6 months old. A big, healthy baby with bright eyes and a smile that could melt even the coldest heart. Sarah carried him everywhere, tied on her hip while she worked, sleeping beside her at night. She never let him out of her sight. Marcus used scraps of wood and nails to make their small cabin stronger. He built a door that could actually close, a tiny window with shutters, and even a small patch of floor that didn't flood when it rained. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Still, dark clouds were gathering. In Charleston, Josiah Crane's debts were piling up. His rice crops weren't selling. His shipping investments had failed. He owed money, lots of it, and creditors were knocking at his door. The only way out, he decided, was to sell some of his enslaved people. One humid afternoon in August 1827, a slave trader named Nathaniel Gadsden arrived. He was known across the South, a cruel man who bought enslaved people cheap and sold them for profit, no matter what families he tore apart. He and Crane walked through the plantation, inspecting workers like they were livestock. When they reached the kitchen garden, Sarah was there, tall, strong, sunlight catching her face. Jacob slept on her back, wrapped in a sling. Gadsden stopped and stared. "Lord Almighty," he said. "Is that the giant woman I've heard about?" "That's Sarah," Crane replied. "Strongest worker I've got." Gadsden's eyes shifted to the baby. "And the child?" "Her boy. About 6 months." Gadsden smiled. "How much for the child?" Sarah froze. Her hands gripped the handle of her hoe so tight her knuckles turned white. She didn't turn around, but her whole body went still. "I hadn't considered selling him separately," Crane said. "I've got a buyer in Savannah," Gadsden continued. "A wealthy family wants a baby they can train from birth. They'll pay premium. I can give you $400, cash, right now." $400. It was more money than Crane had seen in months. The plantation owner looked at Sarah, then back at Gadsden. "400, you say?" "Today," Gadsden nodded. "I take him with me when I leave." "Peter," A young enslaved boy hiding nearby, later said Sarah made a sound then, not a scream, not a word, but something deep and low. Like a wounded animal. She didn't speak. Crane didn't answer right away. But everyone who heard that conversation knew what it meant. Crane needed the money. Jacob's fate was sealed. That night, in cabin 7, Sarah and Marcus whispered for hours. No one knows what they said. But whatever it was dangerous. By morning, Marcus was gone. He had vanished into the swamps, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and something hidden inside his coat, a map and a letter. Sarah had sewn them there herself. The map showed the way from Marsh Bend to Charleston. The letter explained everything, that Crane was about to sell a 6-month-old baby, begging anyone who found it for help. It was a desperate plan. Almost hopeless, but it was the only chance they had. When Crane learned Marcus had escaped, he exploded in rage. He ordered the overseer, Grimball, to gather every man and every dog. Search parties rode out immediately. The air was filled with shouting, barking, and the sound of horses tearing through the swamps. By noon, they found him, exhausted, bleeding from dog bites, trying to cross a creek 8 miles from the plantation. They dragged him back to Marsh Bend in ropes, half dead but still breathing. And that's when the real horror began. Crane announced that he himself would deliver the punishment. Every enslaved person was forced to gather around the whipping post. Sarah was made to stand in the front, so she could see everything. To be continued. Call to action for YouTube. If you felt Sarah's pain and Marcus's courage, don't miss part 4 of the Chains of Marsh Bend. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and share this story so their voices are never forgotten. Would you like me to make part 4 next? The punishment and the horrifying night that followed, in the same YouTube story format, around 1,000 words, with hook and call to action. Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 4, The Whipping Post. Historic horror series based on true accounts. Hook: for YouTube narration. The sound of drums didn't call to war that morning, it called to pain. Every man, woman, and child at Marsh Bend was forced to gather, eyes wide with dread. In the center of the yard stood Marcus, tied, bloodied, but unbroken. And Sarah was made to watch. What happened next became one of the darkest moments ever whispered about in the Low Country. This is part 4 of The Chains of Marsh Bend, a true horror born from history. Part 4: The Whipping Post. Approximately 1,000 words, simple and cinematic storytelling. The August sun beat down like fire. The air was thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. By mid-morning, every enslaved person on the plantation stood in a rough circle near the old cypress tree, the one used as the whipping post. At the center, Marcus was tied with thick ropes, his back bare and his wrists bleeding from where he had fought against the bonds. The dogs that had caught him still growled nearby, their mouths foaming. Josiah Crane stood in front of him, holding a whip made of braided rawhide, the kind that tore skin with every strike. He looked calmer than he had in days. To him, this was order restored. Sarah was forced to stand only a few feet away. Her hands shook, but her face was stone. Hester tried to hold her arm, whispering, "Don't look, child, don't look." But Sarah did not move. She would watch. Crane's voice rang out, "Let this be a lesson to all of you. There is no mercy for a runaway. This man thought he could defy me, thought he could steal from me, thought he could write letters to Charleston." The crowd murmured in fear. No one dared breathe too loudly. Crane raised the whip. The first strike snapped through the air like a gunshot. Marcus's body arched in pain, but he didn't scream. The second, the third, each one cut deeper, until blood began to soak the ground. Still, Marcus stayed silent. Crane grew angrier. His face turned red. "You'll speak, you'll beg." But Marcus did not. He lifted his head, eyes unfocused from pain, and looked straight at Sarah. Something passed between them again, the same unspoken message that had bound them from the start. A promise. Crane's arm moved faster, harder. The whip made a sound like tearing cloth, over and over, until even the white overseer Grimball looked away. Children began to cry. The dogs whined. Still, Marcus didn't scream. Finally, Crane stopped. His breathing was ragged. His shirt clung to his body with sweat. He dropped the whip, stepped back, and spat on the ground. "Greater than, hang him by the post," he ordered. "Leave him there till morning." The men obeyed, tying Marcus upright so his torn back pressed against the wood. He hung there in silence as the crowd was dismissed. Sarah didn't move. She stood rooted to the ground long after everyone else had gone. That night, the air at Marsh Bend was strange, too quiet. The crickets had stopped. Even the frogs were silent. In cabin 7, Sarah sat with Jacob, rocking him slowly. The child reached for her face, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the door. When the moon rose high above the trees, she wrapped Jacob in a blanket and whispered, "Sleep, my heart." Then she stood, picked up a lantern, and walked outside. The guards had gone to drink. The fields were empty. Only the sound of the wind moved through the cane. She walked to the cypress tree. Marcus still hung there, his head slumped forward. His breathing was shallow but steady. When she reached him, she set the lantern down and touched his face gently. His eyes opened just a little, enough to see her. "Sarah," he whispered, voice barely human. "Shish," she said softly. "I'm here." She pulled out a small knife, the one Marcus had carved from bone long ago. With careful hands, she cut the ropes. His body collapsed into her arms. She laid him gently on the ground. The blood soaked into her dress, but she didn't notice. "Can you stand?" she asked. He tried, but his legs gave way. His strength was gone. Sarah looked toward the main house. The windows glowed faintly in the distance. The man who had done this to Marcus slept there, dreaming of money and control. Something inside her broke. Not like glass, like thunder splitting a tree. She stood, trembling, her breath coming in hard, heavy bursts. For the first time since anyone had known her, Sarah's face was not calm. It was rage, pure and cold. She whispered, "No more." What happened next would never be written in the plantation records, but the stories lived on in whispers. That night, people said they saw a tall shadow moving through the yard, a woman carrying something in her hand, her long dress dragging behind her. They said the dogs didn't bark. They only whimpered and backed away. In the main house, Josiah Crane woke suddenly. He heard the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, coming down the hallway. When the door to his room opened, the lantern light flickered and almost went out. "Who's there?" he shouted. The figure stepped into the light. It was Sarah. Her dress was stained dark, her eyes black in the dim glow. Crane reached for his pistol on the table, but his hand trembled. "Where's the child?" he demanded. Sarah didn't answer. She stepped closer. The lantern flame reflected off the blade in her hand, the same knife she'd used to free Marcus. Crane backed away, tripping over the chair. He tried to shout for help, but his voice caught in his throat. The overseer Grimball would later claim he heard something that night. Not words, but a low sound, like the growl of a storm rolling over the fields. Then silence. When morning came, Crane was found sitting upright in his bed, eyes wide open, lips pale. There was not a mark on him, no blood, no wound. But his face was frozen in terror. The doctor who examined him said his heart had simply stopped. Sarah and Marcus were gone. The next days were chaos. Search parties rode for miles, but they never found them. Some said they escaped into the swamps and reached Charleston. Others swore they saw Sarah's shadow wandering the fields at night, holding a baby wrapped in white cloth. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Marsh Bend was never the same again. The cypress tree where Marcus had hung withered and died within weeks. The dogs refused to go near it. And every night, the workers said they could still hear something faint on the wind, a woman's voice, singing softly, like thunder far away. Call to action for YouTube. If this story chilled your heart, wait for part 5 of the Chains of Marsh Bend. The horror isn't over, and what returns to Marsh Bend will make the strongest hearts tremble. Right finger, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so you never miss what happens next. Would you like me to continue with part 5, The Return to Marsh Bend, where Sarah's legend turns supernatural and the haunting begins? Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 5, The Return. Historic horror series based on true accounts. 3 nights after Josiah Crane's death, the marshes fell silent. No birds. No frogs. No wind. But the people of Marsh Bend swore they heard something else, a baby crying where no child lived anymore. This is part 5 of the Chains of Marsh Bend, when history turned to horror. Part 5: The Return. Approximately 1,000 words, cinematic and simple language for narration. The summer heat still clung to the ground when Josiah Crane was buried behind the main house. The grave was shallow, the wood of the coffin cheap. Even in death, he was stingy. The preacher who read the words over the grave kept glancing around, uneasy. The servants who stood behind him looked pale and fearful. They didn't come to mourn. They came because they were ordered to. By sunset, the preacher left without supper, saying he felt a sickness in the air. That night, Overseer Grimball took control of Marsh Bend. He promised the creditors he would keep the plantation running until Crane's estate was settled. But even Grimball couldn't control what began to happen after the burial. The first sign came on the 4th night. A kitchen worker named Dinah woke to the sound of footsteps outside her cabin. Heavy footsteps, slow and dragging, moving through the dirt. She thought it was a patrol rider, until she realized the steps were too close together, more like someone barefoot. Then she heard a baby's cry. Faint, muffled, it came from the direction of the cypress tree. Dinah peeked through the cracks in her cabin wall. The night was clear, the moon white and cold. Near the old whipping post, she saw something standing still, something tall. The figure didn't move, but the air around it shimmered, as if heat were rising from the ground. Dinah pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from screaming. When she looked again, the figure was gone. But the baby's cry still echoed faintly across the fields. By morning, the story had spread through the quarters like wildfire. They say she's back, whispered Hester, the midwife. Sarah. No one said her name too loudly. To speak it, some said, was to call her. Grimball called the workers together and shouted that anyone spreading ghost tales would be whipped. But that night, even he couldn't sleep. Because just after midnight, the horses began to panic in the stables. They kicked the walls until their hoofs bled. The dogs refused to leave their cages, whining and snapping at shadows. And from the marsh beyond the fields came that same sound, a soft, distant lullaby. A woman's voice. 3 days later, one of the field hands disappeared. His name was Eli, a young man who had mocked the others for being afraid. Ghosts don't scare me, he said. Ain't no dead woman walking these fields. That night, he went to the riverbank to check the water gates. He never came back. At dawn, they found his footprints leading into the mud, and then stopping. As if something had lifted him straight out of the earth. The only thing left behind was his hat, half buried in the sand, and the faint imprint of a woman's bare foot beside it, much larger than any man's. Grimball tried to keep order. He brought in a preacher from Charleston, a man known for driving out unclean spirits. The preacher arrived with a Bible in one hand and a pistol in the other. He insisted on visiting the cypress tree first. The moment he stepped near it, the wind rose from nowhere. The branches rattled though no storm was coming. The preacher's candle blew out. Then came the smell, something damp and old, like earth mixed with iron. Blood. He began to pray loudly, shouting the words, his voice cracking. But halfway through his prayer, he went silent. His eyes went wide. He turned, dropped his Bible, and ran. When the others caught up to him on the road, his hair had turned completely white. He would not speak again. The plantation began to rot from the inside. The rice fields flooded and wouldn't drain, no matter how they worked the gates. Tools went missing, then turned up days later, twisted and broken. Grimball grew paranoid. He kept a lantern burning in his quarters all night, the pistol always beside his bed. But even that didn't save him. One night, around the middle of September, he woke to the sound of breathing. Slow, steady, heavy. Inside the room, he sat up fast, pistol in hand. Who's there? The lantern flickered. The room was empty, except for the window. It was open, the curtains blowing in the breeze. He walked closer, heart pounding. The moonlight spilled across the floor, and he saw footprints in the dust. Large, bare, wet footprints, leading straight toward his bed. The smell of mud filled the air. Something cold touched the back of his neck. He turned, swinging the pistol wildly, and fired. The next morning, the workers found him slumped against the wall, eyes wide open, his throat bruised with the shape of a single, massive hand. There was no sign of who or what had done it. By October, Marsh Bend was nearly abandoned. The creditors couldn't find anyone willing to stay. The few remaining workers were moved to nearby plantations. But the stories didn't stop. Travelers passing through the old Charleston road claimed they saw a tall woman standing by the river, holding something in her arms. When they called out, she vanished into the fog. Boatmen on the Ashley River said they heard a woman singing to a baby as the mist rolled over the water, the same melody Sarah used to hum in the fields. Even years later, long after the plantation house had rotted away, people avoided the land around Marsh Bend. Hunters said the ground there stayed soft, no matter how dry the season. The trees grew twisted, as if reaching away from something buried beneath them. And every August, on the anniversary of Marcus's death, locals claimed they could hear the distant sound of footsteps walking through the rice fields, slow, heavy, unyielding, followed by a baby's faint cry. They say Sarah never left. That she walks the marshes still, protecting the souls of those who suffered there, and punishing anyone who dares to exploit the land where blood once fell. Some call her the Wall. Others call her the Tall Woman of Marsh Bend. But among the few who still live nearby, when the night grows quiet and the fog rolls in, they whisper her name softly, not in fear, but in respect. Tall Sarah, guard us. Call to action for YouTube. The ghost of Sarah still haunts the marshes of South Carolina, a spirit born of suffering, vengeance, and love that refused to die. In Part 6 of the Chains of Marsh Bend, the haunting spreads beyond the plantation, and the curse of Sarah Crane begins to touch the living. Right finger, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share if you want to hear what happens when history refuses to stay buried. Would you like me to continue with Part 6, The Curse of Marsh Bend, where Sarah's legend becomes a terrifying mystery for the next generation? Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 6, The Curse Awakens. Historic horror series based on true accounts. They said Marsh Bend was finally empty. No master, no workers, no life. But 50 years later, when the new owners returned to rebuild, the ground began to breathe again. This is Part 6 of The Chains of Marsh Bend, When the Curse Awakened. Part 6: The Curse Awakens. Approximately 1,000 words, written in cinematic storytelling for narration. For half a century, the lands of Marsh Bend lay untouched. The house collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but blackened beams and crawling vines. The marsh slowly swallowed the fields that once grew rice, and the sound of frogs returned to the air, though, locals said, never at night. By 1897, the land had been forgotten by all but the oldest folks in Charleston County. That was until Thomas Whitlock, a northern industrialist, purchased it. He was a man who didn't believe in ghosts. A veteran of the Civil War, with skin hardened by experience and a heart for profit. He planned to drain the marsh, rebuild the plantation house, and turn it into a lumber estate. The locals warned him. "Some lands don't want owners," said the storekeeper in town. "That ground's got memory." Whitlock only laughed. Superstition doesn't stop progress. He hired 50 workers, mostly freedmen and migrants, and set up camp near the old foundations of the Crane house. The first thing they did was clear the cypress grove. The second thing was to cut down the great cypress tree that had stood at the center of every story. It took them 2 days. On the third, when the final blow of the axe hit the trunk, the earth trembled, just once, like a shudder. The men swore they heard a cry echo through the marsh, low, mournful, and full of pain. But Whitlock told them it was just the wind. That night, it rained. Not a light summer rain, but a downpour that lasted through the dark hours, turning the camp into a river of mud. Lanterns went out. Horses screamed in their stalls. One worker, Samuel Lee, went missing. At dawn, they found him hanging from the stump of the cypress tree, his eyes wide, his mouth full of mud, and his hands clutching at his own throat as if he had tried to tear something off. There were no footprints in the mud around him. Whitlock buried Samuel quickly, refusing to delay the project. He told the men they'd get extra pay if they stayed, but by nightfall, 5 more had left. The next morning, the foreman's wife woke screaming. She said she saw a woman standing outside her tent, tall, dripping wet, her face hidden in a shadow. In her arms she held something wrapped in cloth. The woman didn't move, just stared until the lantern light flickered out. When the wife screamed again, the figure was gone, leaving behind only a wet print on the dirt floor, the size of a man's boot, but bare. Whitlock laughed when he heard the story. Ghost stories don't build roads, he said. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen. Tools disappeared overnight and were later found rusted through, as if they had lain in water for years. The air around the old well grew thick and heavy, like breathing through a damp cloth. And every evening, at dusk, a low hum floated through the fields. The men swore it was a woman's voice, singing a tune that made their skin crawl. One night, Whitlock decided to prove there was nothing to fear. He took 2 men and a lantern and walked toward the ruins of the old house. The foundation stones still lay there, slick with moss. Beneath one cracked slab, Whitlock noticed a hollow sound. He ordered the men to pry it open. Inside, they found something wrapped in rotting burlap. It wasn't bones, not entirely. It was a bundle of old chains, black with rust and shaped like they had been bent by human hands. And beneath them, lay a single baby's rattle carved from wood. Whitlock held it up. A toy, he said, smirking. Proof your ghost was just a woman with a child. But when he dropped the rattle, it made no sound when it hit the ground. It landed softly, as if the earth itself had caught it. Then the lantern flickered, and went out. The men swore they saw her then. A tall shape rising from the ground, dripping with mud and shadow. Her eyes glowed faintly like embers, and her arms were long, almost reaching her knees. She held something close to her chest, and from it came a soft, hollow wail. The men fled. Only Whitlock stayed frozen, unable to move. When the light returned, he was still standing there, staring into the dark. He said nothing for 3 days. By the end of the month, the project was abandoned. Most of the workers refused to stay another night, and the supplies were left to rot. Whitlock paid them what he could and returned to Charleston. But something had followed him. The servants at his townhouse said they heard footsteps on the stairs at night, wet, dragging footsteps. They found water stains on the floor that wouldn't dry, no matter how many times they cleaned. And one evening, Whitlock's wife awoke to find him standing in the corner of the room, staring at their infant daughter's crib. When she asked what he was doing, he said, in a voice not quite his own, "She won't let me bury them again." The next morning, he was gone. The police later found him miles away, standing knee-deep in the river near Marsh Bend, eyes open, lips blue, and mud packed beneath his fingernails. The property passed through several hands over the years, each owner meeting strange misfortune. Fires, floods, illness, always something unnatural. The people of Charleston stopped buying the land altogether. They said it belonged to the tall woman now. But among the few who still remembered the old stories, whispers began to change. They said Sarah Crane's spirit had grown restless, no longer tied to her grave. That the curse was no longer one of vengeance, but of warning. Every time someone tried to rebuild or claim Marsh Bend, she rose to remind them. The past cannot be buried. Call to action for YouTube. The curse of Marsh Bend has awakened, and it's only just beginning. In Part 7, the descendants of Thomas Whitlock return to uncover the truth about the haunting, and awaken something far older than any of them imagined. Right finger stay tuned for Part 7 of the Chains of Marsh Bend. Like, share, and subscribe, because history's ghosts are watching. Would you like me to continue with Part 7? The Descendants, where the Whitlock family begins to investigate the haunting using early 1900s spiritualism and seances, and the spirit of Sarah reveals her voice through the medium. Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 7, The Descendants. Historic horror series based on true accounts. In 1903, the Whitlock family returned to Marsh Bend. Not for farming, but to speak with the dead. What they awakened that night wasn't just a ghost, it was a memory that wanted blood. This is Part 7 of The Chains of Marsh Bend, The Descendants. Part 7 The Descendants. Approximately 1,000 words, written in cinematic storytelling for narration. The year was 1903, and the nation was changing. Electricity buzzed in the cities. Automobiles rolled through Charleston's cobbled streets, and talk of scientific spiritualism was on everyone's lips. Among those fascinated by the idea of speaking to the dead was Eleanor Whitlock, daughter of the late Thomas Whitlock, the man who had rebuilt Marsh Bend and died mysteriously in the river. Eleanor was 29, bright, and fiercely skeptical. She believed her father's death had a rational explanation: madness, guilt, maybe even disease. Yet something about Marsh Bend haunted her dreams. She would wake in the night soaked in sweat, hearing distant humming, a woman's voice, deep and sorrowful, singing a tune that faded as she opened her eyes. At first, she ignored it. But one morning, when she found her pillow damp with muddy water, she made a decision. She would return to Marsh Bend. Eleanor traveled from Charleston with two companions, Professor Alaric Finch, a self-proclaimed investigator of the supernatural, and Margaret Hensley, a medium known for her seances among Charleston's upper class. They arrived at the abandoned estate in late October, just as the first frost coated the marshes. The once grand land was now a graveyard of trees and half-buried stones. Crows gathered on the remains of the old cypress stump like sentinels. Whitlock's ruined home still stood, though leaning, its roof collapsed in one corner. Inside, the air was heavy, cold but thick, like breath lingering too long. Professor Finch set up his instruments, barometers, electromagnetic detectors, and phonographs. "If there's activity here," he said, "we'll capture it." Eleanor stared at the fireplace where her father's journal had supposedly burned. "Then let's begin." That night, they gathered in the parlor, 3 candles, a small table, and the wooden baby rattle Thomas Whitlock had unearthed years before. Margaret, the medium, placed her hands on the table and closed her eyes. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Spirits of Marsh Bend, we seek only understanding. If you are near, give us a sign." At first, nothing, only the sound of wind sighing through the broken shutters. Then one candle flickered, though there was no draft. Professor Finch leaned forward, adjusting his recorder. "Note: first movement detected at 9:17 p.m. Margaret's voice changed, lower, rougher. "She's here." Eleanor stiffened. "Who's here?" Margaret's eyelids fluttered. "The woman. The tall one." The table trembled beneath their hands. Eleanor felt a pulse through the wood, like a heartbeat. The rattle on the table began to move, rolling slowly, then faster, until it clattered to the floor. And then the singing began. It was faint, as if coming from under the ground, a low, drawn-out melody that made Eleanor's eyes sting with tears though she didn't know why. "Sleep, my baby, sleep. The river's dark and deep." Margaret's head jerked up, her eyes wide and white. She's saying the name." The phonograph needle scraped violently. Then, in a voice that was not Margaret's, not anyone's, came the words. "Jacob." The candles went out. When they relit the lanterns, Margaret had fallen to the floor, gasping. The professor was pale. The phonograph reel spun freely, though the wax had melted as if from heat. Eleanor bent over Margaret. "What happened? What did you see?" The medium whispered, "A woman, holding a child. She was by the river. She said, he was taken from her. That he cries still. That the water won't let him rest." Outside, thunder rolled, though the sky had been clear moments before. Eleanor felt a chill down her spine. Her father had been found standing in the river. Could it be connected? She retrieved her father's old trunk from a collapsed closet. Inside, beneath rusted tools, she found a journal, half burned, but legible. The last entry read, "She stands at the water's edge. Every night closer. She says his name. I think she wants me to see." Eleanor read the words aloud. Margaret's breathing steadied, but her hands still trembled. "We shouldn't stay," she whispered. "That's not just a spirit. That's a curse bound by pain." Professor Finch disagreed. "Which makes it all the more valuable to study." Eleanor ignored them both. She was staring through the open window, to where the cypress stump still stood, black against the lightning flashes. For just a second, she thought she saw her, a towering shape, motionless in the rain, watching. By morning, Finch was gone. His bedroll was empty, his instruments scattered. There were no footprints leading away from the house, only a long trail of water leading toward the well. They found his hat floating inside it. Eleanor and Margaret fled into town the next day, shaken but alive. They reported Finch's disappearance to the local sheriff, but no search was ever conducted. The sheriff simply crossed himself and said, "Best let Marsh Bend rest." That night, in her Charleston townhouse, Eleanor replayed the phonograph recording. At first, it was static. Then came Margaret's voice, trembling, "Spirits of Marsh Bend." And faintly beneath it, another voice whispered, "He still cries." Then, a baby's laugh, high, soft, and impossibly clear. The glass in the phonograph shattered. Weeks later, newspapers in Charleston reported strange sightings near the Ashley River. Travelers spoke of a tall woman walking through the fog, holding a bundled infant. Sometimes she would vanish. Other times, she would look directly at them. And wherever she appeared, the air smelled faintly of mud and iron. Eleanor never returned to Marsh Bend again. But she spent the rest of her life studying local folklore, publishing several papers under a pseudonym. Her final note, written just before her death in 1929, contained a single line. "The curse is not vengeance. It is inheritance." Call to action for YouTube. The Whitlocks thought they could understand the haunting of Marsh Bend, but what they uncovered was only the beginning. In Part 8, a new generation will return to the plantation during the Great Depression, when a forgotten grave is found, and something buried deep beneath the marsh begins to move again. Right finger stay tuned for Part 8 of the Chains of Marsh Bend. Like, share, and subscribe, because some families can never escape the past. Would you like me to continue with Part 8, The Unearthed Grave, where workers in the 1930s dig up the forgotten remains beneath the marsh, and the curse begins to spread beyond Marsh Bend itself? Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 8, The Unearthed Grave. Historic horror series based on true accounts. In 1934, workers came to Marsh Bend to dig a drainage canal. They said it was cursed land. They were right, because when their shovels struck the buried wood, the marsh started to bleed. This is Part 8 of the Chains of Marsh Bend, The Unearthed Grave. Part 8 The Unearthed Grave. Approximately 1,000 words, written for American YouTube audience, simple, cinematic, chilling. By the 1930s, Marsh Bend was more myth than memory. Children dared each other to walk its borders, whispering about the tall woman who wandered the fog. No one lived there anymore, until the government came. It was the Great Depression, and the Federal Works Progress Administration had begun hiring men to dig canals through the South Carolina lowlands. The plan was to drain old plantations for farmland and prevent flooding. When the engineers arrived at Marsh Bend in the spring of 1934, they found acres of soft mud, half-sunken ruins, and one massive black stump, the remnant of the old cypress tree. Locals refused to work there, so the foreman brought in outsiders, men from Georgia and Alabama who didn't know the legends. One of them was Henry Dalton, a young man desperate for work. He was 22, with blistered hands and a newborn son back home. The first morning, as he walked across the field, his boot sank into the muck and came up dark red. "Just iron water," said the foreman. But it looked too much like blood. The crew began digging a trench near the edge of the old house's foundation. They joked about ghosts, but none of them liked working near the well. It was sealed with planks, but cold air still rose from between the cracks, the kind that smelled like old rain and rot. On the fourth day, the men's shovels hit something solid. "Wood," said Henry. "Feels like a box." They cleared the mud, revealing what looked like the corner of a coffin. The foreman cursed. "Probably an old grave. Rebury it and move the trench." But curiosity got the better of them. They pried the lid loose. Inside wasn't a coffin. It was a small wooden chest, lined with iron nails and filled with chains. And beneath the chains was something worse, a skull, small enough to fit in both hands. The moment the air touched it, the ground trembled. A gush of black water surged up from beneath, filling the trench and soaking their boots. The foreman yelled for everyone to back off. They did, all except Henry, who was staring at the skull. It was cracked along one side, as though something had crushed it. And around its neck, Still tangled in rusted wire, hung a fragment of cloth, the color of faded blue. That night, the camp was restless. The men said they heard weeping from the trees. One claimed he saw a woman standing knee-deep in the canal, rocking something in her arms. Henry couldn't sleep. The image of the skull wouldn't leave his mind. Near midnight, he heard something outside his tent, slow, wet footsteps. He thought it was rain. But when he looked out, the ground was dry. Then he saw her, a tall, dark shape standing at the edge of the trees. She wasn't moving, just watching. Her face was hidden by her hair, and in her arms was that same small bundle. Henry whispered, "Ma'am." The figure tilted her head, and the baby in her arms began to cry. Henry stumbled back, heart racing. When he blinked, she was gone. But the next morning, his boots, left outside the tent, were full of muddy water. The foreman decided to seal the box back in the ground, but it was too late. The men started falling sick, fever, coughing, rashes that wouldn't heal. The doctor from town called it marsh fever, but the locals said it was the curse of the woman who'd been disturbed. By the 7th day, 2 men had died. Henry wanted to leave, but he needed the money. And part of him felt drawn to the site, like something wanted him to stay. He found himself walking back to the canal at night, whispering apologies into the darkness. "Didn't mean no harm," he'd say. "Didn't know it was you." Sometimes, the air would answer, a whisper that sounded like wind, or maybe a woman's sigh. On the 10th night, lightning struck the marsh. It hit near the cypress stump, splitting it open. When the fire burned out, the men found something in the ashes the next morning, bones. Not one set, but 2. One large, one tiny. The foreman finally called off the project. The government shut it down within the week, citing unsafe soil conditions. But Henry couldn't forget what he'd seen. Before leaving, he returned to the stump. The mud was still hot from the lightning. He knelt and saw the outline of a face in the dirt, not bone, not wood, but impression, like someone had pressed their cheek into the ground. And in his ear, clear as a whisper, he heard, "You took him." He ran, not stopping until he reached the road. Months later, back in Georgia, Henry's newborn son grew sick. Doctors said it was pneumonia. But when the boy died, his body was found cold and damp, as if he'd drowned in his sleep. The coroner's notes mentioned something strange, a faint smell of river water on the child's skin. Henry never recovered. He wandered for years, moving from job to job, always near rivers or swamps. People said he'd sit by the water at night, whispering lullabies to someone who wasn't there. He was found dead in 1941, face down in a marsh outside Savannah, his hand clutching a small wooden rattle. After the incident, the government declared Marsh Bend a restricted area. But even then, hunters and travelers reported seeing strange lights moving across the water, and hearing a woman's voice singing to a baby. The song was always the same. "Sleep, my baby, sleep. The river's dark and deep." Some said it was grief. Others said it was warning. But those who truly listened believed the truth, that Sarah's spirit was not just haunting Marsh Bend anymore. She was spreading, searching for what had been taken. Call to action for YouTube. The curse has broken free from the marsh, and now it's reaching for the living. In Part 9 of the Chains of Marsh Bend, the story moves into the 1950s, when a team of paranormal researchers returns to document the haunting. But what they record on their tapes will finally reveal the horrifying truth behind Sarah's curse. Right finger, stay tuned for Part 9, The Voices on the Tape. Like, share, and subscribe, because some ghosts don't rest, they remember. Would you like me to continue with Part 9, The Voices on the Tape, where modern ghost hunters capture Sarah's spirit speaking through static and discover the final secret buried beneath Marsh Bend? Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 9, The Voices on the Tape. Historic horror series based on true accounts. In 1956, a team of paranormal researchers brought new technology to the old plantation known as Marsh Bend. They wanted to prove ghosts weren't real. But when they pressed record, something answered. This is Part 9 of The Chains of Marsh Bend, The Voices on the Tape. Part 9, The Voices on the Tape. Approximately 1,000 words, written for American YouTube audience, cinematic, simple, terrifying. By the mid-1950s, Marsh Bend had become an urban legend in the Low Country. Teenagers dared each other to drive out past the flooded rice fields and listen for the crying woman. Hunters refused to enter the woods after dark. That summer, Harold Givens, a psychology professor from Charleston College, decided to investigate. He wasn't a believer in ghosts. He was a man of science, fascinated by reports of electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, sounds supposedly made by spirits that could only be heard through magnetic tape recorders. With grant money and a small team of graduate students, Givens traveled to the remains of Marsh Bend in July 1956. The group included Eleanor Finch, a linguistics student who specialized in sound frequencies, Tom Reeves, the technician who maintained their bulky reel-to-reel recorder, and Alan Scott, a quiet, superstitious veteran who'd fought in Korea. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon, when the air hung thick with heat and mosquitoes. The plantation was little more than a ruin, scattered bricks, a leaning chimney, and the black stump of the old cypress tree. The locals had warned them. One old man at the gas station had said, "Don't stay past sundown. She walks when the frogs start to sing." They laughed it off. They set up their equipment in what used to be the main house. The tape recorder sat on a folding table, wires stretching across the dirt floor. A microphone hung from a tripod near the center of the room. Dr. Givens pressed the red button. "Recording 1, he said into the microphone. "Marsh Bend Plantation, July 12, 1956. Controlled test for environmental sound interference." Static hissed softly through the speakers. For 30 minutes, they sat in silence, noting every sound, insects, distant thunder, the occasional croak of a bullfrog. Then they stopped the tape and rewound. At first, it sounded normal. But halfway through, something changed. Between the gaps of silence, faint, almost like a breath, came a whisper. "Help, Jacob." The voice was slow, female, and trembling. Tom froze. Did you hear that?" Dr. Givens smiled, trying to hide the unease rising in his chest. "Probably a radio signal. Let's do another." They recorded again, this time near the well. The microphone picked up a strange echo, like wind moving underwater. When they replayed the tape later that night, the echo wasn't wind. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like someone humming a lullaby. "Sleep, my baby, sleep." Eleanor covered her mouth. "That song, where have I heard that before?" Alan stared at the speaker, his face pale. "My grandma used to sing that. Said it was from the slave songs. From the marshes." Dr. Givens turned the recorder off. "We'll continue in the morning." But Eleanor couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., she woke to the sound of water dripping. She thought it was rain, but when she stepped outside, the sky was clear. She followed the noise toward the well. The wooden cover had shifted slightly. A smell rose from inside, old, stagnant, like decay. Then came a faint sound, a baby's cry, echoing from deep below. Eleanor leaned closer, whispering, "Hello." The cry stopped, and from the darkness came a whisper, so close she felt it brush her ear. "Bring him back," she screamed, stumbled backward, and ran to the tent. When the others arrived, the well was quiet. The next morning, they decided to record one final session before leaving. Eleanor refused to go near the well again, so they set up inside the old slave quarters, cabin 7, the one still standing near the tree line. They pressed record. Dr. Givens spoke clearly. "If there is anyone here with us, we wish to hear your voice. Can you tell us your name?" "Nothing. Just static." He continued. "Were you hurt here?" Static. Then, softly, "He took my child." Eleanor's hands shook. "Oh God." The voice grew louder, closer, layered over the crackle of the tape. "Greater than, he took my child. He took him. He took." The recorder suddenly screeched, the tape spinning wildly before snapping. Tom yanked the plug from the wall. The machine smoked. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the far corner of the cabin, they heard the sound of chains dragging across the floor. Alan raised his flashlight, and the beam caught a wet footprint. Then another. Then a tall shadow that seemed to stretch up the wall. The air turned icy. "Doctor," Givens whispered, "run." They bolted for the truck. The door slammed behind them with a sound like thunder. When they looked back, cabin 7 was burning, no flames, just light, white and blue, spilling out through the cracks in the walls like lightning trapped inside. The team never returned. 3 weeks later, Drive. Givens mailed the surviving tape reels to the college archive, marked "Do Not Play." But curiosity doesn't rest forever. In 1982, a graduate student found the box and digitized the recordings. She sent a copy to a paranormal investigator. That investigator's report, now part of Charleston's Historical Society records, describes what was on those tapes. A woman's voice repeating the name, Jacob. The sound of waves, though the plantation was miles from the ocean. And, in the final seconds, a man's voice whispering, "She's still here." Locals say the Marsh Bend swamp still hums at night. If you play those old recordings near the water, the static changes, it matches the rhythm of breathing. And sometimes, if you listen closely, a second voice joins in. Not a woman, not a man, a child. Call to action for YouTube. The recordings were never explained. The original reels were destroyed in a mysterious archive fire in 1991. But the legend didn't die, it spread. Because what if Sarah's spirit wasn't trapped at Marsh Bend anymore? What if those who hear her voice invite her in? In Part 10, the final chapter of the Chains of Marsh Bend, the story comes full circle, when the descendants of Josiah Crane return to sell the land, and uncover what Sarah left behind. Right finger don't miss Part 10, The Blood in the Roots. Like, share, and subscribe, and remember, some stories don't end. They wait. Would you like me to continue and write Part 10, The Blood in the Roots, the grand finale where the curse finally reaches the Crane family in the present day? Title: The Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 10, The Blood in the Roots. Historic Horror Series Final Part. When the land was sold again, the blood remembered. More than a century after Sarah's death, her curse finally found the family that started it all. This is the final chapter of the Chains of Marsh Bend, Part 10, The Blood in the Roots. Part 10 The Blood in the Roots. Approximately 1,000 words, written for cinematic YouTube narration, historic horror style. The year was 2024, and the marshes of South Carolina had grown over what was once Marsh Bend Plantation, a wild sprawl of cypress, reeds, and whispering water. For decades, the land had remained untouched. Locals called it cursed. The county refused to build near it. Even the birds seemed to avoid flying over the swamp. But money erases fear. A corporation called Crane Development Group, owned by Richard Crane, a wealthy real estate investor, bought the property for pennies. He planned to build luxury homes and call it Bend Estates. Richard Crane had never heard of Sarah Marsh or Josiah Crane. He didn't know his ancestor was the man who'd once owned the plantation, and the woman who died beneath it. Not until he came himself to break the ground. It was late autumn when Richard arrived with his teenage daughter, Lila, and a small crew of surveyors. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The swamp was still, too still. No frogs, no birds, not even the buzz of insects. Just the wind moving through the reeds like a sigh. They set up camp near the ruins of the old house, now only a cracked foundation buried in moss. Lila wandered off, snapping photos with her phone. "Dad, this place is creepy," she said, half laughing. He smiled. "That's what makes it valuable. History sells." But when she looked down at one of her photos, her smile faded. Behind her, just at the edge of the frame, was a shadow shaped like a woman, tall and bent, standing by the old well. That night, the crew gathered around a lantern while Richard reviewed the plans. One worker, an older man named Earl, spoke quietly. "You sure this is safe ground, Mr. Crane? Folks say there's bones in that swamp. Old slave graves, back from the Crane plantation days." Richard waved him off. "We'll have them moved respectfully, if we find any. Don't spread ghost stories." Earl didn't answer. But later, as the wind picked up, Richard caught him praying under his breath. Around midnight, Lila woke to a faint sound, a lullaby. Soft, distant, coming from the well. Sleep, my baby, sleep. She froze. The same tune played from her phone, though no app was open. Then, a voice whispered through the speaker, the same recording drive. Gibbons, team had captured 70 years earlier. He took my child. Lila dropped the phone and ran to her father's tent. Dad, someone's out there. She cried. Richard grabbed a flashlight and stormed toward the well. Who's there? He shouted. Only silence. Then, the light flickered. And in the beam, a woman stood half submerged in the swamp, her dress clinging to her like wet paper, her eyes black hollows. Water dripped from her hair. Her voice trembled through the air. Your name is Crane. Richard's breath caught. What did you say? You took him from me. The swamp behind her began to stir, dozens of shapes rising from the muck, human forms without faces, their chains dragging through the water. Richard stumbled back. The flashlight fell, sputtering. When he looked again, she was gone. But the air smelled of rotten iron, and the ground beneath his feet pulsed like a heartbeat. By morning, 2 of the workers were missing. Their tracks led toward the cypress grove, and ended at a pool of dark water. Earl refused to stay. This land don't want you here, he said, packing his things. It remembers. Richard didn't argue this time. He wanted to leave too. But before they could, Lila disappeared. Her footprints led straight to the well. Inside, Richard saw her phone at the bottom, still glowing faintly. Then, from deep below, came a small voice, his daughter's, whispering. Daddy, she says I have to stay. Richard screamed, reaching in, but the rope, old and frayed, snapped beneath his grip. And from the darkness below came another sound. Chains. 3 days later, a rescue team arrived. They found the camp abandoned. The well had collapsed, swallowing part of the old foundation. In the mud, they found one thing. Richard Crane's handprint, pressed deep into the earth beside his daughter's phone. The final photo on it showed a blurry woman holding a baby, standing beneath the same cypress tree that still grew over the swamp. Authorities declared it an accident. Locals called it something else. They said Sarah Marsh had finally been heard. Epilogue. Months later, Crane Development Group went bankrupt. The land was reclaimed by the state, officially marked as environmentally protected. No one builds there now. But sometimes, on misty nights, fishermen swear they see lights under the water, blue and white, pulsing like the old recordings described. And if you walk close enough to the well, you'll hear it. A woman's voice humming that same old lullaby, followed by a child's laughter. They say she's not angry anymore. Just waiting for the next Crane. And that was the final chapter of the Chains of Marsh Bend. A curse born from cruelty, carried through time, and buried in blood. If you felt the chill, hit like, subscribe, and share this story, so others can hear it too. Because legends only die when no one remembers them. And some stories, like Sarah's, refuse to fade. Subscribe for more historic horror stories. Drop of Blood comment your favorite part of The Chains of Marsh Bend. Crescent moon and never go near a silent swamp.